Welcome to the June 2022 edition of Open Source Matters, where we cover the latest news in open source technology. I'm your host, Ben Lloyd Pearson. Let's dive in. Patent trolls, be wary. The open source community might be the worst possible target you can have. A multi-year story of legal intrigue recently came to what might be a definitive conclusion, when an infamous patent troll was stripped of the rights to a patent they claimed the GNOME Foundation infringed upon. The case all started back in 2019 when Rothschild Patent Imaging, or RPI for short, filed suit against the GNOME Foundation over functionality contained in the Shotwell app. RPI claimed this app violates their patent, which describes a system and method of capturing and receiving devices that transmit digital images over wireless networks to filter and store the images. To many, this is an obvious use case of yet another generic patent that describes simple capabilities being carried out by software systems, and should thus not be possible to patent. In the following months, the open source community rallied behind the GNOME Foundation to raise over $150,000. It should be no surprise that RPI quickly agreed to a settlement that following May that absolved the GNOME Foundation and all other code licensed under a license approved by the Open Source Initiative from any restrictions relating to this patent. While this protected the GNOME Foundation and the broader open source community, this wasn't enough for some people. Specifically, McCoy Smith, founder of LexPan Law. He took it upon himself to file a re-examination of the patent in question in late 2020. Earlier this year, the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office finally determined that the patent was not for a new invention and that RPI's claims to it were canceled, officially ending RPI's ability to use this in any future suits. If there's a moral to the story, it's probably to keep your patent trolling away from the open source community, because we can and will defend ourselves. In what might be 2022's biggest case of "it's about time," NVIDIA has published their Linux GPU kernel modules to GitHub under an open source license. Open source developers everywhere are rolling back the expletives that they have posted over the years to describe NVIDIA and are cautiously optimistic about a future where NVIDIA forges closer ties with the open source community. However, this release isn't free from limitations. For instance, the only official support is for a small selection of GPUs in specific scenarios, and a significant amount of the NVIDIA graphics stack is still contained in proprietary firmware and user space modules. So this release should be viewed through a lens of what is to come in the future rather than what this means for NVIDIA users today. Engineers at Red Hat played a critical role in making this happen, and they hope to leverage these open source drivers to improve the Nouveau project, a community-led initiative to reverse engineer NVIDIA GPU drivers. This release should also have broader implication for Linux users everywhere as NVIDIA hardware becomes increasingly easier to support. Great work, NVIDIA, but your job's not done yet. Let's move on to some other open source news. The Open Source Security Foundation, or OpenSSF, continues making hits with their latest publication, the Open Source Software Security Mobilization Plan. This plan is the result of work completed at the Open Source Security Summit in Washington, D.C., and is a direct response to U.S. President Biden's executive order on improving the nation's cybersecurity, which came out last year. Key topics in the plan include developer education, code auditing, data sharing, using software bill of materials, scanning, digital signatures, and more. The OpenSSF believes that these are high-impact actions that can improve the resiliency and security of open source software. Read the full guide for more details. GitHub has long supported the open source community, and a new project seeks to highlight open source stories that help grow the collective knowledge of everyone working in the space. Dubbed the README Project, this site brings attention to open source developers by giving them a platform to share their stories about open source culture, security, software development, and more. Content includes featured articles from tech industry leaders, guides on growing and participating in open source communities, and a podcast that contains in-depth interviews. If you're interested in open source, there is certainly something for you at the README Project. LWN is hiring. We don't normally cover organizations who are hiring, but the LWN is one of the longest-running internet publications for free and open source software development, and have served a critical role in keeping the world informed about advancements in some of the largest developer projects. In January, the organization will reach 25 years of publishing activity, and they're actively looking for a new generation of technology writers to pass on the torch. They're seeking writers with expertise in Linux, Rust, systems administration, and embedded systems. If this sounds like it's up your alley, check out the announcement blog post over at the LWN. Typically, at this point, we dive into the new open source project Rapidfire. However, either last month has been a slow release cycle, or y'all simply aren't publicizing your open source projects well enough. If it's the latter, reach out to us at osm@mattermost.com to share your recent open source launch, and we'll consider including it in our next show. Instead, this week we're going to share some open source articles worth reading. The Future of Linux. Fedora leader Matthew Miller shares his thoughts on how the Linux community can continue to grow. How to make community recognition more inclusive. Ray Pack explains how to look beyond metrics to make community participation more meaningful and impactful. Testimony on open source software and security. Brian Behlendorf spoke in front of the U.S. House Committee on Science and Technology about the work of the OpenSSF. How open source leads the way for sustainable technology. Hannah Smith argues that much of the success in open source can and should be applied to developing sustainable technology. That's your Open Source Matters for June 2022. We'll see you next month.